Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier, with a presentation that sets out to explain just what the Cold War was. Something we can forget about as we get to grips with the three topics on our course. Why it came about, the crises that unfolded, and the collapse of the East European bloc and the Soviet Union itself. Well, we won't. It's too important. First and foremost, the Cold War was an ideological war, a war of ideas, of which system, which set of principles benefited people the most, which way of life was best. In economic terms, does capitalism and a free market economy provide more goods, a higher standard of living, and better welfare provision? Or does communism and its command economy, controlled by the state? Then there is liberal democracy, with free multi-party elections, a free and privately owned media, and freedom of speech. Rights of citizens are recognised and protected by laws and an independent judiciary. Or there is communism and one-party rule, with its focus on equality for all, and in its own way protecting rights too, for example the right to work. I'm not going to explain how each side of the divide works, nor the questions we should be asking of each system, not in this presentation, but I do so in my ebook on the causes of the Cold War, which I call Explaining the Cold War, if you want to check it out. The context of the time is always important in explaining why things happened when they did. And for the Cold War, the ideological differences were there in the 1920s and 1930s. But there wasn't a Cold War. So what was different in the 1940s? Well, World War II had left the Soviet Union in a position to extend communism into Eastern Europe. It had left it one of just two superpowers, even if a badly wounded one, whereas America saw that it couldn't go back to the isolationism of the 1920s and 1930s. Not if its way of life was to predominate in the world. It felt it had to face the challenge presented by the awakening giant that was the Soviet Union. And it felt it had to resist communism wherever it tried to spread. Britain and France would be allies, but they had shown themselves too weak in dealing with Mussolini, Hitler, and Japan to lead the fight. America felt it had to accept the responsibility of leadership of the Western world. But the Cold War was also a propaganda war, played out in the race to the moon, the race for gold medals in the Olympic Games, and in the boycott of each other's games, America boycotting Moscow in 1980 and the Soviet Union boycotting Los Angeles in 1984. Even who had the best chess player became so important. International aid became a tool to gain influence too. And that it was a propaganda war also meant it was a war of words. Freedom versus tyranny, or exploitation, not aid, the Soviet response to Marshall Aid. It was a war of personalities too. Winston Churchill, Roosevelt, Harry Truman and Joseph Stalin, Kennedy and Khrushchev, Mao, Ho Chi Minh, Brezhnev, Gorbachev and Reagan. And personalities do all they can to bend history to their will. The Cold War was, of course, about power. America, as well as the Soviet Union, sought to assert control over their own blocks and extend it, particularly in the Third World. Economic power was a factor, and it was used to gain political influence. And don't forget, in the Cold War's early years, the European empires were in the process of ending their formal control. But each side also sought to assert military dominance. This was the case with regard to conventional as well as nuclear weapons. With alliances and military bases strategically placed on both sides of the Iron Curtain in Europe, as well as around the world. For example, in Japan for America and in Cuba for the Soviet Union. I talk about ripples when I explain how the Cold War spread out to dominate the world and beyond. It begins and ends in Berlin. It divides first Germany and then Europe. Churchill referred to an Iron Curtain dividing Europe. It spreads out to the rest of the world, China, Korea, Cuba, and the length and breadth of Central and South America, Africa, the Middle East, and back in Asia, Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia. You will look at crises in Berlin, Korea, Cuba, Vietnam, Hungary, Berlin again, Czechoslovakia, Poland, indeed across Eastern Europe, before returning to Berlin yet again. But note that with the nuclear arms race, the Cold War actually enters space too. But as I think I've already made clear, at the centre was always Berlin. It was where it started, when American and Soviet troops met as Hitler was committing suicide in his bunker. The city was then divided between the four occupying powers, and it was where, with the Berlin blockade, I feel the Cold War really began. Though there are other claims to its starting point, the Potsdam Conference, the Truman Doctrine, or Churchill's Iron Curtain speech. Berlin was where a wall would be erected, bringing about one of the biggest crises of the Cold War, and it was where it would end, with the collapse of the wall, climbed on and torn down by ordinary Berliners. And so it's just left for me to say, as always, thanks for listening. But I'll give you a reminder that the 3 Cold War topics on your course are available in one combined ebook, the Cold War topics that I have on Amazon at a bargain price. Well, I would say that, wouldn't I? Anyway, I really do thank you for listening. I hope this presentation has been useful for you. Cheers.